everyone, and welcome to SciTech Expo, and welcome to Earth Day. Happy Earth Day, everyone. We are so excited that you have joined us for this program today, and we hope that you do get to spend a little bit of time outside enjoying the Earth as well. My name is Miranda, and I'm an educator here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, and today we are talking about plant extinction and how can we learn from the past and avoid these extinction events in the future? So before we get started, I want to hear from you. So during the entire program, I want you to drop any questions or comments you have in the chat, either on Zoom or on YouTube, and we will get to those questions at the end. But right now, I want to know, what is your favorite plant? It can be a native plant to North Carolina. It could be a non-native plant. It could be a house plant, anything. I want to hear, what is your favorite plant? I have to say that my favorite plant currently is my coral honeysuckle. And I think that, it is like the best performing plant that I have in my yard. I've had it for years and years. And it finally adapted itself to what I can provide it in my yard. I have a lot of trees, so there's some shade issues. But it is a fantastic plant. It is covered with flowers right now. And I just figured out yesterday that they actually are sweet if you bite off the end of them. And Hugo says his favorite plant are tulips, which of course are very pretty and, an early sign of spring flowers. Adam loves cherry blossoms, of course, another, I think those just bring you good feelings when you see them, right? All right. Yes, rabbits can be an issue. Rabbits and deer. Colin likes tulip trees. I have a tulip tree out the front of my yard, and I love finding the flowers after they fall down. All right. Okay. Well, I want to introduce our speaker for today. So today we have with us Wesley Knapp, and Wesley is the mountains ecologist and botanist with the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program. He inventories and helps protect some of the best habitats in North Carolina and, by extension, the Eastern United States. He has a bachelor's from Catawba College, a master's from Delaware State University, and is a PhD candidate at UNC Chapel Hill. So Wesley, thank you so much for joining us, and I am definitely excited to hear more about these extinction events and how to prevent them in the future. I know it's really important for us to help maintain these habitats at the museum. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Pleasure to talk about such a sad topic like extinction, but hopefully we can all learn from this, maybe move forward. And coincidentally, this critter here in the bottom right, this beautiful white flowering plant called the Franklinia tree, it is one of my favorite plants. So we'll talk more about the Franklinia tree as we move forward. But as was brought up a little bit about me, so I work for the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program. I get to explore and protect many amazing places in North Carolina. Before I moved here in 2016, I did the same kind of job for the Maryland Natural Heritage Program for 15 years. So at this point, I have a long history of exploring and discovering. And my work's made a little bit of an impact, which is probably why I'm here today, like New York Times, Washington Post, stuff like that. And I publish a lot. So I have this weird mix of field person and academic, which to me is exciting because my days are never really the same. But I'm going to warn everybody, I'm going to use a lot of scientific names today. I do have common names in the talk, but I want to talk briefly about the importance of scientific names. So for instance, in North Carolina, we have about 4,350 plant species. And without the scientific name, we would be lost about what plant we were talking about, because there's only one scientific name for every organism. And I know people get scared by scientific names, but we all learn scientific names when we're little. Stegosaurus, Tyrannosaurus rex. So they're not that intimidating. We just have to be willing to learn them. And this is important because, like, this tree on the right here is Carpinus caroliniana. In North Carolina, we call that ironwood. If I was in the Midwest, they call that musclewood. So the scientific name really helps anchor what organism we're exactly talking about, because every plant and some animals will have multiple common names. So it's really hard to talk common names, but I've tried to sprinkle them throughout the talk for every organism I talk about to give you something a little less intimidating to look at. But for those of you who don't know, North Carolina Natural Heritage Program, it's a program in the state government and Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. And our mission is to inventory, catalog, and facilitate protection of the rarest and most outstanding elements of biodiversity in North Carolina. I'll say element in this talk, and that just means an element of biodiversity. It can be a high quality habitat. It can be a very rare species, but we track elements of biodiversity. In the heritage program, we maintain lists of rare plants, animals, and high quality habitats, natural habitats that we update the rare plant list or animal list every 2 years. We're a little behind because of COVID. But we also have this guide to the natural communities of North Carolina by Shafley. That's like called the fourth approximation to the habitats of North Carolina. So those are some publicly consumable documents on our website. And we also have county inventory reports where we go to a county and inventory all the natural areas. We've done 98 of the 100 counties for North Carolina. But we protect places. We do dedications, which are the highest level of protection for properties in the state of North Carolina. We work with private organizations to register habitats, which is another form of protection. We also help with conservation easements. So it's a real mix of academic type work and on-the-ground conservation. And all the data we collect upticks internationally through an organization called NatureServe. If you've never heard of NatureServe, they're a not-for-profit based out of DC, but they have an international footprint. So when we talk about the rarity of an organism, it comes with like an international kind of standard methodology and authority. But most of what I'll talk about today, there's extinct plants. It was published in the Journal of Conservation Biology not that long ago. It's a free PDF if you want to look at it. And what I want to point out first off is there's a lot of authors on that paper, because to understand the extinct plants of North America or the United States and Canada, it takes a lot of experts to provide information and vet the information. This is truly a collaborative project. But this project started a long time ago with my career with the Maryland Heritage Program. So every state has this list of rare, threatened, and endangered organisms. So Maryland, our plant list back in Maryland was very dry. It's a list of scientific names, common names, and then ranks. We'll talk about these ranks later. But the plant that captured my imagination was this plant called Nuttall's micranthemum, micranthemoides, because it's the only plant in the flora of Maryland that was considered historical, globally historical, GH, state historical, or extinct, extirpated. And I didn't realize we had extinct plants in Maryland. I didn't realize we had extinct plants in North Carolina. So I thought that was like a problem of the tropics. So I, as a person who's tasked with inventorying rare species, I learned as much as I could about this plant. I wanted to rediscover it, but spoiler alert, I didn't rediscover it. It's extinct. And this is the plant in question. Nuttall's micranthemum is an intertidal mudflat species that occurs between high tide and low tide. I call it the opposite of charismatic megafauna, because you think about lions and tigers and bears. This is the other end of that spectrum. This is a very small plant. It's hard to identify. It wasn't even considered rare, but it was last collected on the 13th of September, 1941. And here's a collection. There are 3 duplicates of this collection. So this is a herbarium specimen. So the plants are dried, mounted on archival paper, and they're housed in museums. And again, no one even recognized this was rare. And all of a sudden, we looked around as a community and realized it was gone. And a lot of man hours have been spent looking for this plant. So I started questioning what other extinct plants are known from the U.S. We don't even recognize them, that they're extinct. No one had done this work. Because when I talk to botanists, we usually know about Franklinia. This is that tree on the front cover. That's one of my favorites. This is called the Franklinia tree. And we know about this because it has a real story. You'll find this in botanical books and biology books, because it was collected a single time in the wild on October 1st, 1765 in Georgia, along the banks of the Altamaha River. And there's a book called Bartram's Travels. It's actually on the shelf behind me. And in this book, he just talks about how he's going down the trail. He collected this shrub. He's going to name it after Benjamin Franklin. He grew these plants out, thank God. And then it's really never been seen in nature since then. So what have we lost? It was it made me realize there's a huge knowledge gap between extinct animals and extinct plants. And because of that, we don't know what we've lost. We don't know how to protect things. Because you can find books on extinct animals, like there's thylacine, all sorts of information about extinct birds. There's even published literature on extinct freshwater fauna, so like mussels, arthropods, that kind of stuff. But plants were overlooked for some reason. So we tried to do a study just to figure out what the extinct plants were of the U.S. and Canada. We wanted to figure out the rates of extinction, because as we all are kind of aware, the Anthropocenes, the current era we're living in, things are changing. Climate change is a real thing. We're going to expect to see more extinctions over time, but we don't know what the current extinction rate is. We wanted to draw attention to these extinct organisms to help drive conservation efforts. Like, what can we learn? and how do we prevent future extinction events. Now, there's a little bit of a minutia topic here I need to discuss, which is presumed extinct or globally historic. Because just because a plant hasn't been seen in a long time doesn't mean it's extinct. It could just be in the landscape and overlooked or not being surveyed for. So extinction is a hypothesis, and you can only disprove a hypothesis. So I hope some of these plants are found that I'll be talking about today, but we had to have a working list. We decided that if the plant hadn't been seen for over 25 years and had been searched for, we're going to consider it, globally extinct or historical. For the purposes of this, I'm just going to say extinct because it's a big mouthful to say globally historic or presumed extinct all the time. And we're looking at the rate of extinction since the European settlement. So once the European settlers arrived here and started cataloging the flora in like our quote unquote, Linnaean way of naming plants, that's what we were looking for. And I'm not talking about extirpations, because plenty of plants have been lost from a given state, but they're still found in other places. We call that extirpated. We're talking about global extinctions. Now, it's an artificial study area. I understand that. We're looking at the US and Canada. But there's a huge publication series called The Flora of North America, which is 28 volumes, I believe. It includes the mosses, which are technically plants. And we wanted to have something parallel to that to look at. Now, the Flora of North America does include Greenland. We didn't include Greenland. So it's a very similar unit. And we didn't look at Central America because the flora is still relatively poorly known there. And we didn't look at Hawaii or Puerto Rico because there are so many things lost from Hawaii that if we included Hawaii in the data set, the extinction rate really skyrockets. And that needs to be its own study. So how did we go about even tackling something like this with so many plants in the flora? We did a lot of literature review, a lot of books, a lot of manuals, a lot of written research, but we also talked to a lot of botanists. I can't tell you how many people I'd asked, what's extinct in your state? Like you're the expert in the flora of Arizona. Talk to me about the flora of Arizona, that kind of thing. But we also had that NatureServe database that I mentioned, that uptick of data internationally to look at and to query that for historic or extinct things already. NatureServe uses a pretty simple matrix for extinction where S5 is a subnational or state rank, global is the global rank, and 5 is the most common something can be. So you think about red maples. In North Carolina, they're S5 because they're everywhere and they're globally abundant, so it's G5. But you come up here to like critically imperiled, you're talking about plants that are known from one or few places in the entire globe being G1, whereas S1 would be one or few places in North Carolina. Because you can have a plant that's very rare in North Carolina, but very common globally. But in NatureServe's data here, we have globally extinct or globally historic, which was a place we could look at for names. But a lot of people don't appreciate how much debate there is in science about what is a valid species or a meritorious species, what is worth recognition. If you just look at a database trying to find what's extinct, you get a huge number of names, like 150 names. But not all names are created equal. So that Franklinia tree I mentioned, everybody accepts that as a distinct meritorious plant. But there are plants like Rubus fryi that no one thinks is distinct from other plants. And these represent problematic names because this plant's either extinct or it's not real. So you either have something of incredible conservation value if it's found or something that isn't worth conservation at all because it's not real. So we had to come up with a way of verifying all these names. And we just came up with a simple index, looking at all of the literature. We called it the Index of Taxonomic Uncertainty. And we had to use like the published treatments for that, but we tried to stay away from mega databases. And if you're not familiar with mega databases, don't worry about it. But places like NatureServe have giant databases of all these names that you can search with range maps, etc. But what I want to take home message from all that is that we have all these names of things that could be extinct, but they're not all created equal. What we found is we made this index with category A. This is like grade school grading. So a name with an A rank, everybody accepts universally. A name with a B has almost majority taxonomic acceptance, which means most experts recognize it as real, but a couple might not. Then we have names like category C, where most people don't recognize it as real, but there's still a number of experts who are saying, no, that is a real and a different entity. But then we have organisms like DNF. We consider these dubious names, where they were either published as new to science and then no one ever recognized the name again or the organism again, or there are just so few people who believe or accept it as a name that we're not going to worry about. Just know that there is debate among what constitutes a species, and that has real implications for on-the-ground conservation. So for the purposes of this work, we just looked at those first three categories where we had a lot of different experts who believed in the species. We have 65 presumed taxa extinct in North America. And I say taxa because these aren't all species. Some are subspecies or varieties. But we still think they're worth recognition, so we keep them in our list. And I'm just showing this graphically because I found this to be really interesting. So the category A are the things everybody agrees on. B and C are these debated groups, and D are these red categories. And what I found really interesting, and my take home from the slide, is that the experts usually don't agree, but with the extinct plants, they really did. There was a huge consensus about what organisms were real. There was a smaller category about things that were debated, and then a huge category that everyone just kind of agreed these things aren't legit. So I just found that very interesting to see it graphically depicted. So what did we learn? Okay, there's 51 species that are gone, or 65 taxa, so there's 14 subspecies or varieties that are extinct or globally historic. And there was one study published a couple of years back, riddled with errors. So I just say it was over 108% increase from any previous study. So we identified a lot more extinct organisms than anybody else. 42 of these extinct organisms were what we call single site endemics. They were plants known from only one place in the world. And no one had identified this before. And this raises the importance of protecting very special small patch habitats. But you have to ask, were these really single site endemics, or were they just collected one time by one botanist? So there is some limitations to our data in that. The international standard for conservation ranks, like the nature reserve component, but internationally, like in Europe, is the IUCN Red List. And they only have 2 of these organisms as extinct. So there's a big gap in what we've identified from these 51 to the 2 on the red list. We need to take control, and we're doing that working with the IUCN now to list these properly. So if we have approximately 15,882 species in the US and Canada, that's an extinction rate of about 0.4% of the flora is extinct. And since 1804, which was the last year that Franklininia was ever seen, that's 216 years or so, it's 17 now, we're looking at about 3 plants being lost a decade. But that's probably an artifact of data, and we'll explain that in a little bit. So we have a huge diversity of families that are impacted, and some of these are the biggest families of plants we have, like the daisy family had 8 extinctions. The bean family had 7, rose family 7. The bromes, which are very widespread in the western U.S., had 6. But the grasses, the sedges, and the orchids are massive plant families, and they've only lost 2, 1, and 1 respectively. And we think this is also an artifact of data because, I love grasses, sedges, and rushes, but they're obscure plants. They're difficult to identify. They're usually overlooked by botanists. So we think that many more grasses and sedges have gone extinct before they were ever collected by a botanist. And if you look at the genera, we see that hawthorns are really impacted. These are thorny shrubs that we do get a lot of here in North Carolina, the milk vetches. And then really interestingly, these 2 genera here, the cat's eyes and the popcorn flowers, these are evolutionarily sister genera to one another. They make up almost a huge chunk of this sub-tribe, which is a subgenus within the subgroup of this family, the Boraginaceae. So all 6 of these come from this one family of plants, which is really shocking that one of the biggest losses at the family level would be just 2 genera, and those 2 genera were very closely related. So something's going on here we can't quite figure out. So we just depict these graphically. There's a few interesting take-homes I want you to see. So there's only 2 species that we had these hatch marked ranges on, which were widespread ranges and occupying 4 or more states. Only 2 that were pretty widespread. But we have a huge weighting in this map to the southwestern United States, many more dots in the southwest than in the east. And this is probably an artifact of botanical exploration. So you think about when the European settlers first came from the east, they quickly developed treeless habitats because they had to live. But that's where a lot of botanical diversity is found, is in open treeless habitats. So it's quite possible we lost a lot of stuff in the east before it was ever described. Whereas in the West, we have Lewis and Clark's expedition, other botanical expeditions to go out and document the flora before places were destroyed. There are big gaps in this map, like the upper Midwest has nothing. That's pretty surprising, but it's not the most botanically diverse area of the country, so maybe that's not entirely unexpected. And then we have areas like the Panhandle of Florida, which is a global biodiversity hotspot where we don't have anything, or the Lake Wales Sand Ridge in Florida, which doesn't have anything. And we don't know if this is an artifact of data gaps, or we've done such a good job of protecting habitats in these places that we really, truly have not lost anything yet. California was the biggest loser, 19 plant taxa, broad coverage north to south in the state. California is truly a hyper-diverse botanical state for the United States. Texas, as you'd expect, probably the second biggest, huge state, huge botanical diversity, a lot of weight here along the southwestern border of the state. And we are hopeful, but there's no evidence to suggest this, that some of these might not be extinct and still found in Mexico. So maybe some of these are only extirpated in the United States and still found somewhere. Florida and New Mexico were each tied for 4. But this I want to show this and talk about New Mexico just for a second, because they have a plant called the lost sunflower, aptly named Helianthus primiceris. And I like this example because it's so difficult sometimes when you just have a single plant that's thought to be extinct. And in this case, we don't even know for certain what state this sunflower came from. The label says New Mexico, so we put it in New Mexico. But the group that was doing the botanical exploration that day was in Arizona. So we're not really sure what state this plant even comes from, but everyone agrees that that sunflower is a distinct entity that is now gone. In Florida, we only had 4 extinctions, which is very surprising, all from absolutely southernmost Florida, which is a global biodiversity hotspot. But again, we had these areas, the Apalachicola National Forest, Gulf Coastal Plain, Lake Wales Sand Ridge, loads of endemic, very rare plant species to those small areas and no extinction events. But this is almost entirely an artifact of data as well, because you have a global hotspot like Florida with extinct plants, and then you have a relatively cold spot like New England with 5. Now, I understand we're comparing 1 state to 5 states, 6 to 6 states, but the idea that Florida would have fewer extinct plants than New England's is truly nonsensical. So we kind of expect this is an artifact of sampling how many boots are on the ground. There aren't many boots on the ground doing good botanical work right now. And frankly, 3 of these plants were described by a botanist who worked in the early part of the 19th century. So he discovered a lot of very important things, even after a long period of settlement. So we expect there's still plenty more things to find in other parts of the country that are more diverse. We're going to talk about North Carolina now, because we surprisingly have 3 extinct plants from this very small 2-county region. This is Polk and Henderson County in North Carolina, where we get 3 extinct plants. This dot here is actually in Tennessee on the Lone Mountain Massif. We'll talk about that one a little later. But we have 3 plants. We call this an extinction hotspot, because in the eastern United States, there's no other state that has as many extinct plants from such a small geographic area. So in North Carolina, we've lost the mountain bog asphodel, the big leaf scruff pea, and the large flowered barber's buttons. Now, each one of these extinct plants tells a different story. So the big leaf scruff pea, or Vexillum macrophyllum, is known outside the town of Columbus in Tryon, between Tryon Peak and White Oak Mountain. These are one of the 2 known specimens of this plant, obviously different from any other Urbexillum that's known to science. Has these big leaves. And I want you to notice on this map, there's a lot of green topography on this map. I still expect this plant to be out there somewhere, but people have looked. I've looked. I've spent a few days looking just for this plant with no success. But all we know truly is White Oak Mountain, Tryon, collected June 18th, 1897. So maybe one of you will go out for a hike up here and find this thing and make yourself botanically famous, so to speak. Now, the other interesting plant is outside the town of East Flat Rock. Interestingly, this is where my wife teaches, in East Flat Rock, where it was home to the mountain bog asphodel, Narthecium montana. Now, this plant was known from open wetlands, which is now unfortunately under this industrial complex. And these 2 red counties here show the range of the plant. This is actually 1 county. This is an incorrect map. But here's the specimen, Western North Carolina. And this is a beautiful thing. This is the opposite Urbexillum macrophyllum we just talked about. This plant would stand out to any botanist because the closest living relative, which is called Narthecium americanum, which is still found in the New Jersey pine barrens, but extinct from Delaware and South Carolina. This is a beautiful plant. This specimen does it no justice. These petals would have been bright yellow, no self-respecting botanist or even anyone interested in nature could really walk by that plant without it capturing their attention. So we're pretty confident this plant is gone because it was at a single site. It is very showy, so it's very detectable, and some organisms are less detectable than other organisms. But unfortunately, we believe this is gone. Now, interestingly, this is a specimen from the New York Botanical Gardens, and there's a lot of history on this specimen. There's a letter mounted on this specimen from the Biltmore Herbarium by Beadle, who was one of their foresters and botanists, renowned botanist J.K. Small. And in this letter, he talks about this he's sending this Narthecium because it's new to science. And in here, he says a note. You will also find a specimen, which he mailed to him, of Marshallia grandiflora from the same region, showing a peculiarity for which I've never noticed, that the flower is from rosy purple to white. And this is a fascinating story of what we call dark extinctions, which are extinctions that are happening kind of in the background without light on them. They're dark. And we have 4 plants in the North American flora that qualify as dark extinctions. These are plants that went extinct before they were ever described by botanists. So the idea these were collected before they were named is kind of surprising, and the statistical odds are low. Since 1994, there are 4 plants described that are now extinct. So Coriospermum pallidum, which is known in the northwestern United States, was collected in 1931, described in 1995. This is an orchid, Govinia floridana, described in 2000, last collected in 64. Potentilla uliginosa, last collected 47, described new to science in 2010. And then most recently, this Marshallia grandiflora, the one referenced in that letter from Beadle, was last collected in 1919, and over 100 years later, my colleagues and I described it new to science. And this is the 3rd extinct plant in North Carolina. So Marshallia grandiflora had 2 things hiding in it. You have this thing, which is found from Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And then you have this thing in the orange map that is now extinct. They were all called the same plant, Marshallia grandiflora, which was thought to be this beautiful flowered guy here. Now, this photo comes from Ohio, Powell, Pennsylvania, where I know this plant. This is a rare plant in Pennsylvania, very showy. It's like a botanical rite of passage to see this plant because it's rare. But it occurs along really large river systems in what we call river scour, where the water washes the trees away and kind of prevents perennial vegetation from taking hold. So when I moved here and studied the rare plant list, this range really captured my imagination. Wow, I had no idea this plant occurred in Western North Carolina. Well, it turns out it didn't. What we have is an extinct thing, masquerading as grandiflora. I pulled up some specimens, and you can pretty clearly see these 2 plants really look quite different from one another. This is much larger here on the right, different habitat. And we did a study looking at the seeds. We'll see the grandiflora from North Carolina is much larger, it has larger teeth, more ridges here on the subsali, which are called the seeds, compared to what is also called grandiflora in the mid-Atlantic and the southeast. And this is its closest relative, Legrand's Marshallia, or Legrand's barber's buttons. So you can look at we did some measurements. This is a way to graphically depict how the plants look. So you have the North Carolina plants here, and then the rest of the plants that are called Marshallia grandiflora here. So there's 2 entities masquerading under one name. And the thing that's still around, we had to rename. So we call this now Marshallia pulchra, which is endemic to the Appalachian Plateau physiographic province, which is a major region. We have the Piedmont plant, which is Legrand's Marshallia, and then Marshallia grandiflora truly is this extinct plant endemic to these 2 counties in North Carolina. And here they all are side by side. They're very different from one another. But the fact that this one, the beautiful barber's buttons, Marshallia pulchra, was confused with grandiflora here in the middle, even though they look very different, kind of shows you that there's probably more hiding in our collection record that's already extinct than we recognize. So I predict we'll find more dark extinctions in the collection record than we currently know now, unfortunately. Now, another category that is just fascinating to me are plants that are extinct in the wild. So Franklinia is a story like that. It's extinct. We don't know of any natural place, but thank God it's in the conservation gardens still. Well, before this study, no one had put together a list of the plants that are extinct in the wild, or EW. In our study, we found some categories that we need to qualify. We call something extinct in the wild if there's no naturally occurring population in the world. So we have numerous plants that are EW. We have these plants that are EW ? And those are plants that are reported by conservation gardens, but we weren't able to confirm the identity. So to be careful, we're still keeping on our EW list, because heaven forbid a garden accidentally cuts one of these things down, which has happened. We've had an extinction event from a conservation garden that had it growing and didn't realize they had the last plants in the world. So these are considered EW ? And then this EW star is something that other people have seen and identified that I myself haven't seen, so I just put a qualifier on that as well. One of the stories, and this is kind of a sad story, but I guess there's a silver lining here, is the story of the St. Francis menzelia, which is Arctostaphylos francisana. This plant was thought to be extinct, last seen in 1934. And one of my colleagues, Dan Klausenkamp, in California, he was driving on Doyle's Avenue, which leads to the Golden Gate Bridge. And out of the corner of his eye, he saw this plant. Thousands of people probably drive past this plant every day. They did some woody plant invasive species control on the side of the bank. And lo and behold, they rediscovered this extinct plant. Fascinating and very exciting that this happens. The problem is they were clearing that shrub, that hill bank, which exposed this plant for a road widening project, a shovel-ready project that was not going to be stopped. It's right along the roadside. This plant was rediscovered and immediately threatened with extinction again. And there was no legal mechanism to protect this plant. Because if you're considered extinct, you're not on any protection list. So what did the California Native Plant Society and state government did? We did the best thing they could is they dug this up and moved it. And they moved it to a different place. So it no longer qualifies as a naturally occurring population. This is essentially a gardened population that we've moved down the road. Now, I'm very glad that we've kept this thing. It's not extinct, but technically it's extinct in the wild. Part of me is sad we couldn't come together as a community and allow this plant the one last place in the world that naturally occurred. But this is now in conservation gardens in many places in California. So it's just a nice poster child of things that are extinct in the wild, the San Franciscan menzelia. I kind of hope that someday I'll be able to pull all of these extinct plants together in conservation gardens. I call it extinction gardens, where you can kind of see all these extinct plants co-occurring because they each tell their own interesting story of extinction. Now, there are rediscoveries that happen. And this is really exciting, hot off the presses, unpublished information right now. So that plant that occurred just across the North Carolina line on Roan Mountain is called the Roan Mountain Astilbe crenetaloba. This was last collected September 11th, 1881 in Cloudland, Tennessee, just across the North Carolina line. This is one of the few specimens that were ever made. There's a bunch of different scientists who wrote notes on this because it's such a weird, interesting specimen, and most people recognize it as real. But right after this publication was published on the extinct plants, I was notified there were some very interesting photos on iNaturalist. And this certainly looks like this extinct plant, the Roan Mountain Astilbe. This is in western North Carolina from about the same elevation as Cloudland, Tennessee. Now, we went out to verify this yesterday, but it was still way too cold. It actually snowed on me at elevation near Roan Mountain. But this plant, I'm going to go back a slide. You'll see these big, broad leaves, which are characteristic of the species. The only other species of Astilbe we get has very narrow leaves. In this plant photo, this is obviously Astilbe from the flowers, has very wide photos. Now, the person who uploaded these photos into iNaturalist had no idea what this plant was. And thankfully, they did. If you're not familiar with iNaturalist, that's a website or an app on your phone where you can take pictures of animals and plants and catalog them. And this landowner is cataloging the flora of her woods. Thank God she is, because it led to this potential rediscovery to the flora. But we have some real work to do now. Now, because there is debate, is this plant, the Astilbe crenetaloba, distinct from the common one that occurs in western North Carolina? So we're going to look at the genetics of that plant because we couldn't study the DNA on the driver-bearing specimen. We're going to see if it's reproductively fertile, because if it's not, if this could be just a weird hybrid or something strange happened, or it was infected with a disease and it made big, fat, wide leaves. So there's real study to do here, but now we have the opportunity to conduct those studies because this plant has been potentially rediscovered. So I kind of implore you, if you're interested in nature, download iNaturalist, take photos, enter that data, because it could really lead to a very significant discovery because boots on the ground are thin. Now we should talk about the causes of extinction, because that is actually much harder to identify than you might think. So if a plant was known from a single place and that place is destroyed, it's pretty easy to say, okay, that was human caused, anthropogenic. We destroyed that site. And in the case of the 42 extinct plants that were known from a single site, it's pretty easy to say, okay, those were most likely, those single places were destroyed. But oftentimes it's really difficult to know. So you think about the Franklinia alatamaha, that Franklinia tree. We have no idea why that plant went extinct. Bartram collected it along the trail. And that was one of the last times it was ever seen. We assume, we're kind of inferring it might have been habitat alteration, or maybe a change in fire, or maybe some pest got it. But we don't know. And science is about that hard K, like the truth, to know. So there's a bit of questioning we have to do in almost every extinction event, and what caused that extinction event. When you think about, I showed on the map those two broad-ranging species. That's the St. Clair hawthorn in the Arkansas, Illinois, Kentucky, Missouri area. And then that Nuttall's micranthemum, which ranged from New York to Virginia, which started my love affair with extinct plants. We really don't know what caused those extinction events. Like with the case of the Nuttall's micranthemum, we think it was a death by 1,000 cuts. So you have invasive Phragmites or algae. You have rip-wrapping of stream banks. Even high motor wakes can uproot that plant from its sensitive mud habitat. So we expect, if it wasn't a single site global endemic that habitat was destroyed, we assume there are multiple issues that cause the species extinction. So part of this talk, I hope, is a call to action for people, because preventing extinction is the lowest bar for success we can possibly set. Just keeping some of an organism on the landscape. And we're not always preventing extinctions. And there's a lot of reasons for this. So boots on the ground are thin, which I've said. Like, how many botanists have you ever met in your life who do what I do? There aren't a lot of us out there. And there are so many plants. As you can see, the problem, some earlier problem of math. And then we as a community need to better target the organisms we're trying to prevent that go extinct. Now, we do a great job of conservation and protecting natural landscapes, but sometimes we need to focus a little more. So this picture on the right, this is Pachyra serpenticola, the serpentine ragwort. This is a single-site global endemic known from one place in the world. So we need to think about prioritizing single-site endemics, because as we saw, 64% of them have gone extinct, for ex-situ, which means off-site conservation, and in-situ, like on-site conservation. So off-site, on-site, both are important. You want to protect the place in the land they exist, but also get them growing in conservation gardens where we can maintain their genetic purity, seed bank those plants, so if something happens to them in the wild, we can put them back. And we do need to prioritize, because we as humans, we're distracted sometimes or drawn to the very pretty things. So this is Sarracenia aureophila. That's the green pitcher plant. That is a charismatic plant. Eats bugs. It's super cool, right? We all know about pitcher plants and Venus flytraps. But if I look at a place like the Botanical Gardens Conservation International, this is a database where I can search any plant and see how many gardens have it growing. You'll see that there are 44, right here, ex-situ, outside of the field, collections of this plant globally. You'll see it's critically endangered by the IUCN. So this is a very rare plant. It warrants this type of conservation. But there are more collections in conservation gardens, 44, than exist in the world. There's probably 15 to 20 populations in the world. So we've done this. We're doing a great job. But other plants, like that serpentine ragwort I mentioned, global single-site endemic, found in one place in Western North Carolina, there are 0 collections. So we need to do a better job of prioritizing these very, very rare organisms before they go extinct. And again, here is that Pachyra serpenticola. So part of the work that's coming out of this is to identify the global single-site endemics. What are the plants that are known from only one place? How do you define what one place is? So I'm working with some friends and colleagues at NatureServe, that conservation organization, to identify the single-site global endemics for on-the-ground and outside of the field conservation. Right now, we have 89 identified, and we think that number is going to go up a little bit. We're still vetting that information, and how we're vetting that is we're sending it to those state botanists who know their flora better than anyone to be verified. In this picture on the right here, this is Ryan's aster, Symphyoptricum Ryan. That is known from one place in Western North Carolina, and I believe there's only one collection at the North Carolina Botanical Gardens. to kind of graphically depict where these single-site global endemics exist, this is what we call the MOBI map, the map of biodiversity importance. And the brighter you are on this scale, the more biodiversity importance you have. And this is just for plants. You'll see like California glows in the dark because they have a huge flora. There's areas of the southeast that have a lot of endemics. Like I talked about the Apalachicola region, this is glowing. Lake Wales Standard region glowing. I'll also point out that North Carolina has two really important places, many more than that actually. But according to this map, you look at the coastal plain, which is part of a biodiversity global hotspot, and then the southern Blue Ridge, which is another part of the global biodiversity hotspot. So we have a lot. This is really the places with the most important plant populations. And if you need to prioritize this more, which we do, because that is still a huge number of plant species, if we overlay the single-site global endemics, you see California has 29 single global endemic plant species. Then you have Texas and Utah, the next tier of 11 and 12 respectively. And then most states have very few. So in North Carolina, we have 3 single-site plant endemics. 2 of those are from Western North Carolina, the Buck Creek Serpentine Barrens, and then the other ones along the Yadkin River, and I'll talk about that in a second. But this is at least a baseline for as a community where we should really be focusing in the most targeted way to prevent plant extinctions. How are we doing already without like a focused effort? Well, we're not doing great. So if you look at the 89 plants we've identified, only 9 of them are listed under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. Now, a lot of people are surprised that very rare plants don't immediately get listed for endangered status on the U.S. Endangered Species Act. Well, they don't. This is the third endemic, single-site global endemic in North Carolina. This is Solidago plumosa, the Yadkin River goldenrod. From one place, a beautiful river scour habitat below a dam. If the dam was constructed in a different place, this plant would be extinct. This plant was actually thought to be extinct for a very long time before it was discovered by 2 botanists within 1 day of each other along the Yadkin River. It is a gorgeous yellow showy plant, but this was decided to not be listed by the U.S. Endangered Species Act. They said that habitat is being protected by the power company who owns it, so listing it won't do any good. And I'm not going to even provide a comment on what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does or how they track things. So I just want to draw the correlation that just because you're known from one place in the world does not mean you're going to be federally listed as endangered or threatened. Now, there's another organization called the CPC, the Center of Plant Conservation. They maintain the national seed collection, and 38 of these global single-site endemics are captured. So we're doing a little better capturing them with the CPC level. And then if you look at the Botanical Gardens Conservation International database, which I mentioned before, that database to kind of search any plant to see what garden has it, 55 of these global single-site endemics are captured out of the 89. So we're doing better as a community than you might expect. I will, a giant asterisk on this 55 though, is you're assuming that the identifications are correct if they're put into this database. And I found that to not always be the case. So because there are so many plants, misidentifications are pretty commonplace, unfortunately. And I understand that's why people kind of gravitate to other types of organisms to study, because there are so many plants and they can be confused, and even experts confuse them. But we need to be very careful in our identification of these global single-site endemics, because if we're incorrectly identifying them, we're really going to have some problems in preventing an extinction event. Now, I'm going to go into some conclusion slides, but I want to give you some things to think about. Is that there is so much left to do that you truly can help. So please get active. I didn't mention this in the talk, but in the southeastern United States, we have over 100 plant species that are still to be described by science. And these are things we think are truly real and will merit conservation, and they're still unnamed. So there, even in North Carolina, we probably have 20 to 30 plant species that still need names. So alpha level taxonomy, the discovery of new species, still happens rampantly in the southeastern United States, and you can make an impact. Boots on the ground are thin. So if you're out there exploring, even if you're focusing on your small forested habitat or small grassland, you can make a real scientific impact. I mentioned iNaturalist. Hopefully you're all aware of that. It helps photo document the forest. You don't need to make collections. You're taking a photograph, it's tagging with a GPS pointer, but you can obscure that if you're concerned about it. But it provides information to others. That's how that extinct plant was rediscovered. is through iNaturalist. There are new species of science being documented through citizen science efforts to photo document the plants on their land. So please, consider that if you're interested in biodiversity conservation. You can focus on insects, you can focus on salamanders. This doesn't have to be just plants. I also showed in this talk that extinction is way more common than previously documented. We're talking about 108% increase than previously known. And frankly, we think that's low because of the level of documentation of the flora is still so low. If we are describing 100 plants new to science in the Southeast over the next 20 years, how much has been lost before it was described? And if it hasn't been described, you can't really conserve it. So you can't protect the places in the landscape these very rare and new plants are being discovered. 65 extinct plants is what known. The real number is probably in the hundreds, but that's speculation at this point. So as I argue, we need to preserve global single-site endemics because that's where all of your eggs are in one basket, so to speak. And we are finding that global single-site endemics can be found, many of them at the same place. Like there's a famous habitat in Alabama called the Dolomite Barrens or the Altamaha Barrens, where there are 7 new species to science all occurring on one type of rock exposure. So new species are all around us and they can co-occur together. So off-site conservation and in-site conservation is really critical to prevent extinction events. Because taxa, plants, animals, all groups are slipping through the cracks because there aren't enough of us to do this. We need to work collaboratively, which is another reason I like iNaturalist, because it's people who don't know a lot and experts kind of together in one place, looking at photos together, and we help each other learn by providing identifications, because I can look at groups I know and identify them. And then the person who took the photo learns more as well. So collaboration is truly key because the stakes are far too high to not work together. Now, some things to follow up on and acknowledgments to make. So the Smithsonian was really helpful with getting a lot of literature to me, because as you can imagine, some of these writings on botany are in old journals that are dusty that no one has a copy of. The Smithsonian did. It was great. My job in Maryland and North Carolina Natural Heritage has been really wonderful in helping with this project. If you've never seen the USDA plants database, Gary Moore is one of the people in charge of that. He really helped a lot getting the paper that came out of this as open access so the public can get it. And then a man named Ron Lance helped a lot with the hawthorns, the crataegus, which is probably the toughest genus, in my opinion, in Eastern North America to study. And I will plug his book called Haws, which is a southbound book, lots of pictures that help identification of these plants. Botanical Gardens Conservation International really helped with their database and query. The Morton Arboretum out of Chicago, they helped to vet some information on extinct plants. So again, the community helped a lot with this project. And then if you're interested in some follow-ups, Marion Renault did a story in the New York Times on extinct plants, which came out in September of this year, which was really neat to see. Susan Millis did a piece in the Science News magazine, which focused on underrepresented or underappreciated female botanists and how they prevented extinction events. So there's a really interesting stories published there. And then I had a nice conversation with Matt Candidas on the In Defense of Plants podcast. If you're interested in plants, in my opinion, this is the best podcast out there. So a nice plug to Matt and In Defense of Plants. And I am about out of time, but I'm absolutely wonderfully thrilled to have any questions if there are any.
Thank you so much. It's a really fascinating talk. And I think I know I'm inspired to take advantage of my iNaturalist that I have downloaded on my phone, that I'm not, great about entering everything I see. And actually upcoming, starting April 30th, is the City Nature Challenge that the museum participates in. So if you are interested in learning more about using iNaturalist and documenting species, then that's definitely a good way to start. We'll have some tutorials on how to use iNaturalist and get involved with the City Nature Challenge. So just keep an eye on the website for those programs. But yeah, we do have a couple questions for you. And so first of all, Cindy wanted to know if you can recommend organizations, local, national, or global, that we should be supporting by membership or donations that are doing important plant conservation work.
So you heard me mention NatureServe a lot. They're not-for-profit. They're if you're interested in the nuts and bolts of conservation, that's kind of underappreciated a lot of times. They are definitely a partner to think about. Here in North Carolina, if that's where you are with that question, your region probably has a land trust. And that land trust is always looking for volunteers to help with work days to control invasive species. Or if you have money to donate to a group like that, they are always in need of people on the ground. And we are blessed in North Carolina to have so many active land trusts and conservation groups. So just depending on where you are, Google that, figure out what group is pertinent to you. And then if you're interested, we have the North Carolina Native Plant Society, could always be good to work with as well, just to learn some. So there are plenty of opportunities out there for you at the local, regional, or state level if you were interested.
And Cindy also wanted to know, are any of these organizations good for like getting kids more involved and excited about plants or interested in plants? Do you know of any ways to get kids excited about plants in general, not just endangered plants, but just, get out there and start loving plants?
As a father of two girls, I understand the challenge of getting kids excited about plants. And you can't push them too much. Like I try my best to introduce just one really pretty plant on a trip. And it's usually something in flower, like a trillium or galax or whatever it is that you see on your trip. But many plant societies will offer walks that are either be free of charge or have a nominal fee. And those are great ways to just see special places. Because if you're going to attend a plant walk, it's somewhere that's going to have interesting flora, and you're going to be with an expert who knows those plants, who knows stories about those organisms. So that's what I try to do with my kids anyways, is tell them a fun story about a plant, especially if you can eat it, it smells good, something like that always helps as well. Or if there's an interesting animal-plant interaction, that usually helps tell a story as well. And really beautiful vistas never hurt either. So if you can tie all those into one walk or one hike, that's a great way to do it. And there's so much freely available nature anywhere in the state with our protected land network that you can get out. So you could even go to the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program's website. We have a data explorer, and for free you can draw on the natural areas and you can just see what's around you. So, and then you can Google those places and see their trail network. So you can get yourself into high quality nature pretty easily in North Carolina. We're very lucky like that.
Yeah, it's great. And my experience as an educator at the museum, you see profound change just by, talking about, a plant or an animal and, showing how excited you are about it. So I can definitely understand that. A
little anecdotal story, like I didn't really get excited in plants until I picked up Newcomb's Wildflower Guide, which is a real simple book with a rudimentary key, like how many petals are the leaves alternate. And I found out I could actually identify some of these things. And then I was kind of hooked that I could figure out what these plants were. Because before that, you're like, there's thousands of plants. Where do you start? So iNaturalists are great gateways to identifying plants because they have an AI option, like artificial intelligence will help you identify a plant, or like Newcomb's Wildflower Guide will help you. So once you start down that path of trying to identify the things around you is when it really kind of can become addicting.
Yeah, definitely. And I joined even like on social media, different plant groups, native plant groups and gardening groups. And I've learned a bunch just by scrolling through and seeing like, oh, somebody posted a picture asking what species of plant this is, and then finding out about it and, realizing like, oh, let me go pull all those invasive plants up out of my yard that I noticed have popped up. So I had a question. There's always kind of an undercurrent of talk about, bringing extinct species back using, DNA and, specimens that are in collections and things like that. But, it seems with plants that would be a little bit easier, right? That, I imagine that in these collections, seeds have been kept and things like that. And even thinking of, these plants that are extinct in the wild, but are still in, botanical gardens and things like that. Is there ever any talk about, doing reintroductions of these plants into the wild?
Yeah, so there's a couple things there. So first, you're very astute. You're right. I'm actually leading an effort to try to get these extinct seeds to a collaborator, Valerie Pence at the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Garden, who is a renowned propagator in trying to resurrect these extinct plants. The problem is that herbaria, where these plants are kept, are not really conducive to life, and embryos are alive. So these specimens are usually deep frozen or sprayed with mercury or other harsh chemicals to kind of kill any pests that might accidentally come in. So most of the seeds we've encountered, the embryos are dead. But we're still trying. And then the other thing you bring up about like the reintroduction of these extinct organisms, So there's only 7 plants that are extinct in the wild. So we'd only have 7 opportunities to do that. And each one of those needs to be very carefully vetted. And that needs to be vetted with those people on the ground who know these organisms and the habitats. So we haven't tried that yet, but I believe that Franklinia tree has been planted at different places in Georgia near the Altamaha River, but it's never really taken. So there's usually a hurdle to why that just isn't easy to do. And it's probably because the habitat it occupied was a very special habitat in the first place.
Yeah, especially, you talked about not knowing why some of these species have gone extinct. And I guess, if you do want to reintroduce them, then knowing the whys of why they disappeared
absolutely
very important.
Yeah, but those are the conversations we're going to be having more and more as extinction rates increase, if we have the off-site collections, which we hope to help facilitate, is at least we can have the conversation, whereas most of these things we can't.
Right. Awesome. Well, we are closing in on the hour, and I want to thank you again, Wesley, for joining us. And if you registered for the program, then we can send out some links. I will go ahead and drop them in the chat. It's a lot of links, but in case you want to learn more, we will have those available that you can check them out. You can just do a copy paste or come back to the video on YouTube to look at those. And so just keep an eye on that and your email. And I want to thank Biogen Foundation and the NC SciFest for sponsoring Triangle SciTech Expo. I also want to give a big thank you to the members of the museum. Without our friends, we wouldn't be able to do most of the programs like this. And so we really depend on all of our audience, all of you and our members, our sponsors, for making programs like this happen. Again, happy Earth Day. I hope you get out there. If you haven't downloaded it yet, get iNaturalist on your phone. If you have a smartphone, you can also access it from a browser on a computer. So if you don't have a smartphone to be able to use that, you can upload pictures there. And again, check out the City Nature Challenge coming up on April 30th to really jump in with 2 feet into iNaturalist and documenting species, plants, animals, anything, as long as it's alive. So thank you again, Wesley, and thank you everyone for coming. We hope to see you at more SciTech programs today, tomorrow, and Saturday. Thanks again.